For those of you fascinated by Ireland's ancient past, maybe eager to understand the stories etched in its landscape without getting totally lost in, a mountain of detail, you're definitely in the right place.
Welcome.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a really fascinating journey through Ireland's archaeological history.
That's right. We've got a truly comprehensive guide laid out for us here. It spans everything from the earliest traces of human presence right up to how we understand this incredible heritage today.
Okay.
And our mission really is to pull out the most compelling insights from this huge history, giving you a clear and hopefully engaging overview of millennia in Ireland.
Think of this as your shortcut to becoming seriously well-informed. We'll be following a chronological path, guided by the different archaeological periods that are set out for us. And our journey begins with the really ancient chapters, the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods.
Indeed. So where do we kick off this journey through time? We have to start with the very limited evidence of human presence in the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age.
Right.
And then we move into the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, which is where we see the first real signs of sustained settlement.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. The Paleolithic in Ireland, we're talking seriously old here. What kind of evidence are we actually looking at from this very, very early period?
Well, the evidence from the Paleolithic is quite sporadic, which, isn't really surprising when you think about the conditions back then.
The climate.
Yeah, especially the dramatic climatic shifts of the last glacial maximum. For a lot of this time, Ireland would have been just covered by ice sheets. Pretty much uninhabitable.
Right.
But we do have some tantalizing clues.
Okay, so what are some of the key pieces of evidence then? What have we actually found from the Paleolithic?
Well, there's a fragment of a reindeer bone. It was found in Castlepook Cave down in County Cork.
Okay.
And this has been dated to around 33,000 years ago, which suggests some form of human interaction with the landmass at a very early stage. Probably not continuous settlement, though.
33,000 years.
Yeah.
That's hard to even wrap your head around. And wasn't there something found in a cave in Clare as well?
Yes, exactly. A bare patella, a kneecap.
The kneecap.
Yeah, discovered in Alice and Gwendolyn Cave in County Clare. Now, what makes this find significant are the really clear-cut marks on the bone.
Made by tools.
Made by stone tools, yes. And this one dates to around 12,500 years ago. So towards the end of the last glacial period, suggesting human activity just as the climate started to warm up again.
So it sounds like maybe brief visits, perhaps, during these slightly warmer intervals.
That seems to be the general understanding, yes. There was also a worked flint found near Drogheda in Mel. That one's potentially much older, maybe predating 70,000 BC.
Whoa.
But the prevailing scientific view now is that this flint was likely just transported to Ireland by an ice sheet, rather than being evidence of people living there that far back.
All right, so the ice can really complicate things when you're trying to piece together the really ancient past. Okay, so the Paleolithic is more about these fleeting moments then. When do we see people actually establishing themselves properly?
Well, that brings us neatly to the Mesolithic period. It starts around 8,000 BC.
Okay.
And this really marks the first sustained settlement of Ireland. These early inhabitants, they were seafarers.
Right.
Likely arrived by boat, probably from Britain, after any land bridge had, disappeared due to rising sea levels.
Seafarers, that's a really important point, isn't it? Right from the very beginning, we're talking about an island story. And what was life like for these first settlers? What did they find?
They lived as hunter-gatherer fishers. They had to adapt to a really densely wooded environment that grew up after the glaciers finally retreated.
Right, lots of trees.
Lots of trees. And their diet was incredibly diverse. They were drawing from both the sea and the land. We've got evidence of them eating seafood like oysters, mussels, limpets.
Classic Irish seafood.
Exactly, and various fish salmon, trout, eels, and then terrestrial resources too, like hazelnuts, water lily seeds, wild pig, hare, birds.
Sounds like they were very resourceful, making the absolute most of what the environment offered them. And I imagine they moved around quite a bit following those resources.
Indeed. They were mobile, often moving seasonally to take advantage of different food sources as they became available.
Makes sense.
And their settlements were typically located near water sources, the sea, rivers, lakes. Archaeologists have actually identified two main phases within the Mesolithic, based primarily on the types of stone tools they were using.
Okay, tell me more about their Stone Age toolkit. What were they working with?
So the earlier Mesolithic, that's from about 8,000 BC to 6,700 BC, it's characterized by what we call microlithic technology.
The microlithic.
Yeah, it involved using these very small, precisely made flint blades, just a few centimeters long.
Tiny.
Tiny. And they were then set into composite tools like harpoons or spears. They also had ground stone axes.
Okay, and then later.
Then, in the later Mesolithic, from around 6,700 BC down to 4,000 BC, we see the development of larger stone tools. The most distinctive one is the leaf-shaped bandflick.
Bandflick, right, often found near the river band.
Exactly. And they also started using a wider variety of raw materials, not just flint. Things like shirts started appearing more often, and we see specific types like moina points, which were ground slate or shale points.
So it sounds like their technology became, well, maybe not more advanced, but certainly adapted, maybe diversified as time went on.
Mm-hmm.
And where were these Mesolithic people actually living? Were they just setting up temporary camps wherever they stopped?
Well, their settlement patterns show a bit more complexity than just, simple nomadism. We do find evidence of temporary encampments, like at Lough in County Offaly, which seem to have been used for specific activities, maybe exploiting seasonal resources. But we also have evidence of more substantial structures.
Like houses.
Kind of, like the circular pit house discovered at Mount Sandal in County Derry. That dates way back to the earlier Mesolithic.
A pit house. That sounds quite settled. For a group we think of as being pretty mobile.
Relatively so, yes. It suggests a more extended period of occupation, or perhaps just a regular return to certain favored locations. We also see evidence of other types of buildings, including circular structures that seem to have had porch-like features.
Interesting.
And what's really fascinating is the repeated use of certain locations led to the buildup of these deep occupation soils, just layers rich in the remnants of their daily lives.
So you can really see they kept coming back.
Exactly. Some sites even show platforms built along lake edges, maybe for dwellings, maybe just to make it easier to access the water. These persistent places, as archaeologists call them, really highlight their deep understanding of the landscape and a tradition of returning to these favored spots.
It's fascinating to think of these early people having such a strong connection to specific places, even back then. And beyond their stone tools, what other kinds of things did they leave behind? Any organic stuff survive?
Well, organic materials are much less likely to survive over such long periods, obviously. But waterlogged sites have given us some remarkable finds.
Like what?
We've discovered wooden fish traps, some dating back 7,000 years.
Oh.
Which really demonstrates their sophisticated woodworking abilities. There's also evidence of pine torches they used for light, and even what might be a toy boat carved from wood.
A toy boat? That's amazing. Suggests more than just a basic struggle for survival.
Absolutely. Bone points used for fishing have been found too, and incredibly, cowrie shell beads from County Clare.
Cowrie shells, where would they get those?
Well, that's the interesting part. They're not local. These are early examples of personal adornment, and they hint at connections, maybe through trade or exchange with other coastal areas.
So early networks?
Potentially, yes. And they also used red ochre, which was likely for decorative or symbolic purposes. Body paint, maybe?
Could be. It really makes you think about these early communities having connections beyond their immediate area, and maybe an appreciation for things beyond the purely functional. What about how they dealt with death? Any burials?
Evidence for Mesolithic burial customs in Ireland is, well, it's very scarce. We have some cremated remains that were found at Hermitage in County Limerick.
Just cremations.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
But that's really about the extent of our current knowledge for that period.
So much we still don't know. But we do have some key sites that give us a clearer picture, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned Mount Sandal and Lough Bura. They seem particularly important.
Absolutely. Mount Sandal is crucial. It's one of the earliest and most significant Mesolithic settlements we know of. The remains of its substantial circular structures, along with the huge quantities of flint microliths and the evidence of their diet. Salmon, eel, wild pig, hazelnuts.
Right.
It really paints a vivid picture of early life there by the riverband. And the similarities it shares with sites over in Britain are also quite significant. It tells us about connections.
And Lough Bura, being further inland, that showed these early people weren't just hugging the coastlines.
Exactly. Lough Bura was really important because it demonstrated that Mesolithic people had also moved into and adapted to inland environments. The stone tools and hearths found there, along with the remains of eels, wildfowl, and those really intriguing bird bones.
Birds of prey.
Birds of prey and jays, yes. Which does raise questions about whether these birds maybe had a symbolic or ritualistic significance, alongside just being a a source of food.
Symbolic bird consumption. That's a fascinating thought. And then there's Faraday's Cove. Where does that fit in?
Faraday's Cove, down on the Dingle Peninsula, that represents a later Mesolithic site. The evidence there suggests maybe more temporary or intermittent occupation.
Okay.
The lithic debris, the hearths, the shell dumps, they all help us understand their activities there. Drying fish, maybe, we see staples.
Right.
But crucially, the discovery of fish bones and even some human bone fragments, well, isotopic analysis on those bones shows a diet heavy in marine resources.
Ah, the science telling us what they ate.
Exactly. That technique analyzes the chemical composition of bones, tells us about diet, like how much seafood they ate. But what's truly significant about Faraday's Cove is that it also shows the very earliest signs of the next big change, the Neolithic transition.
How so?
Because alongside the Mesolithic evidence, they found cattle bones dating to around 4,350 BC.
Cattle. So farming.
The very beginnings of it, yes.
Yeah.
And a sheep tooth, a flint knife. It makes Faraday's Cove a vital site for understanding that massive shift from a foraging to a farming way of life.
Which neatly brings us right to our next chapter, the Neolithic period.
Yeah.
After all that mobility, all that hunting and gathering, we start seeing people putting down roots, quite literally.
Precisely. The Neolithic, beginning around 4000 BC, marks a really profound shift. It's the arrival of agriculture and a settled way of life. It's a true revolution in how humans interacted with the Irish landscape.
The Neolithic package, I've heard that term. It's a helpful way to think about it, isn't it? What exactly did this package involve?
It included the arrival of domesticated plants, things like wheat and barley, and animals that weren't native to Ireland before then.
Like cattle and sheep.
Cattle, sheep, goats, yes. And these gradually replaced wild resources as their main food sources. We also see the construction of new, more permanent types of houses, the widespread use of pottery for the first time for storage, cooking.
Right.
And very significantly, the beginning of the tradition of building those huge megalithic tombs.
So a complete transformation in how people lived, really. And the impact on the landscape must have been enormous. All that woodland clearance needed for farming.
Absolutely. The shift to farming led to a significant increase in population, we think, and definitely a dramatic alteration of the environment. Extensive woodland clearance to create fields for crops, pasture for animals.
Must have changed everything.
It did. And it also brought about new concepts like land ownership as people became more tied to specific plots of land, and likely more complex social structures to manage these resources. And as we just mentioned, the earliest solid proof of these farmers comes from Faraday's Cove, with those cattle bones from around 4350 BC.
And permanent homes, that must have been a real game changer after the more temporary shelters of the Mesolithic.
Yeah.
What did these early Neolithic houses actually look like?
Well, unlike the more temporary structures of the Mesolithic, Neolithic dwellings were definitely permanent homes, usually built with rectangular or sometimes square layouts.
How big were they?
They varied, but often around 6 to 8 meters long, 4 to 7 meters wide, some were larger. Construction typically involved timber frames, often split oak set into foundation trenches.
Okay.
With walls made from planks or maybe a woven framework of branches wattle and then daubed with mud.
Wattle and daub, right?
Exactly. Roofs were likely thatched. Inside, a central hearth was common, and the archaeology suggests internal partitions, maybe creating different living or working areas, possibly even lofts for storage.
So really, the first proper houses, you could say, built to last, showing a real commitment to staying put and creating a home.
Definitely. Proper houses built to last.
And you mentioned there might have been a symbolic aspect to their construction, too, not just functional shelters.
Yes, it certainly appears that way. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of what looks like ritual deposition. Things like deliberately broken pottery, stone tools, placed within the foundation, trenches, and post holes when the house was being built.
Why would they do that?
Well, it suggests a symbolic act, perhaps an offering to ensure the home's stability, or maybe a way of connecting with the earth, with the spirits they believed inhabited it. Grounding the house, maybe?
Fascinating. And then we have these incredible megalithic tombs. They're such iconic features of the Irish landscape, aren't they? They weren't just practical burial sites, were they? There was more going on.
Absolutely not just practical. These megalithic tombs, built from massive stones megaliths, they were primarily intended for communal burial, yes. But they also clearly reflect complex beliefs about death, about ancestry, the afterlife.
And the effort involved.
Oh, the sheer amount of effort required for their construction is staggering. It points to a highly organized society capable of mobilizing large groups of people for these projects. Some tombs, particularly passage tombs, even show precise astronomical alignment.
Alignments with the sun and stars.
Yes, suggesting a really sophisticated understanding of the movements of the sun, maybe the moon, stars. We've identified over 1,000 of these tombs across Ireland, and they're generally classified into 4 main types.
Okay, let's go through those. Court tombs, they were among the earliest ones, weren't they?
Generally, yes. Court tombs typically feature a U-shaped or semicircular open area at the front, the forecourt. This usually faces east.
Towards the sunrise.
Often, yes. And it leads into rectangular burial chambers. These chambers are covered by a long, sort of trapezoidal mound, or cairn, made of stones. You find them primarily in the northern half of Ireland.
And how are people buried in them?
Burial practices involved both cremation, burning the body, and inhumation, burying the body intact. And associated finds often include Neolithic pottery and flint tools. So you see this focus on a communal burial space with an open forecourt, maybe reflecting tightly knit communities, or a strong emphasis on ancestral veneration, particularly in the north.
Then the passage tombs, those are the really impressive ones, often found in clusters, and sometimes with that amazing megalithic art inside, right?
Correct. Passage tombs are arguably the most architecturally sophisticated. They consist of a large circular mound or cairn containing a narrow stone-lined passage.
Leading somewhere?
Yes, leading to a central chamber, which is often cruciform or cross-shaped, and frequently has a corbelled roof where stones are layered inwards to create a dome.
Ingenious.
It is. And many of these tombs are decorated with that distinctive, abstract, megalithic art spirals, chevrons, circles. Cremation was the primary burial rite here, and they often contain specific types of decorated pottery, known as carrowkeel ware, as well as things like bone pins and stone pendants or balls.
And where do we find these?
They're typically found grouped together in prominent hilltop cemeteries. The most famous, of course, is the Boyne Valley Complex, Newgrange, Knowth, Douth.
World Heritage Site.
Indeed, but also major clusters in places like Carrowkeel and Carramore and Sligo and Loughcrew and Meath and parts of Antrim. These really seem to represent a more elaborate ritual surrounding death, perhaps a belief in an afterlife accessible through that specific passage, maybe linked to those astronomical alignments.
Portal tombs, those are the ones that look like giant stone doorways or tables, aren't they? The really photogenic ones.
Exactly. Portal tombs, also called dolmens, they're characterized by 2 tall, upright stones, the portals, which support a single, often massive capstone. It slopes upwards, creating a simple chamber underneath.
And burials.
Burial practices seem more varied here. Both inhumation and cremation have been found, although often involving only a few individuals, unlike the big communal passage tombs. Finds can include pottery and flint tools. They're mainly found in the northern half of Ireland again, but with notable concentrations down in South, Leinster and Waterford too.
So maybe smaller groups, families.
Possibly. These might represent burials of specific individuals or perhaps small family groups, maybe marking particular territories or lineages with these very striking monuments.
And finally, the wedge tombs. How are they different?
Wedge tombs have a distinctive wedge-shaped rectangular chamber. It's characteristically narrower and lower at the rear end.
Right, like a wedge.
Exactly. They're typically covered by stone slabs and originally would have been encased in a round or sometimes wedge-shaped cairn. They tend to be the latest type of megalithic tomb to be built, chronologically.
And they sometimes show later use.
Yes, sometimes they show evidence of continued use right into the early Bronze Age. Both inhumation and cremation were practiced in these tombs. And later finds can include things like beaker pottery and food vessels, which are more typical of the Bronze Age, suggesting their use continued even as burial practices started to evolve.
Where are they mostly found?
They're predominantly found in the west and southwest of Ireland. Munster and Connacht have large numbers, though there are some in Ulster too. This geographical focus and later date perhaps indicates evolving social units or burial practices towards the end of the Neolithic. Maybe a move away from those grand communal monuments of earlier periods towards more localized or perhaps family-focused burials.
It's just incredible, the variety and the sheer scale of these monuments. You mentioned some capstones weighing up to 100 tons. That really tells you something profound about the organization, the cooperation, the capabilities of these early farming communities.
It absolutely does. The logistics involved are mind-boggling even today.
And you mentioned the side fields earlier. Not a tomb, but a whole preserved prehistoric agricultural landscape. That sounds unique.
Yes, the site fields in County Mayo are truly exceptional. They date back to around 3500 BC.
So contemporary with some of the tombs.
Yes, smack bang in the middle Neolithic. And they represent the oldest known organized field systems anywhere in the world, preserved for millennia beneath a blanket of peat bog.
What can you actually see there?
You can clearly see an extensive network of small rectangular fields separated by dry stone walls, stretching over hundreds of hectares. These fields were farmed, probably growing wheat and barley for centuries.
Wow.
And the associated dwellings and megalithic tombs found within this landscape show us a settled, highly organized farming community. They clearly had concepts of land tenure, land division, and the ability to undertake these large-scale communal projects like building miles of walls.
It really challenges any simplistic assumptions we might have about the sophistication of these early societies. And what about the everyday objects of this Neolithic age, the tools and pots?
Well, the Neolithic toolkit definitely reflects the new demands of a farming lifestyle. We see the first appearance of pottery in Ireland. Early forms were often quite simple, undecorated, round-bottomed bowls, sometimes called Western Neolithic or Lyell's Hillware.
Okay.
Later, different styles emerged, like the Carrowkeel ware found in passage tombs, often with distinctive decorations. Polished stone axes became absolutely essential tools.
For clearing forests.
Exactly, for woodland clearance to create farmland, and also for carpentry, building those timber houses. There were even specific locations, sort of axe factories, where these axes were produced in large numbers and then traded over considerable distances.
Right.
Beyond these new innovations, they still relied heavily on flint and other types of stone for tools like sickles needed to harvest grain.
Makes sense.
And leaf-shaped arrowheads for hunting, which didn't entirely disappear. Plus knives, scrapers, and those saddle querns, the large stones used for grinding cereals into flour.
And some of those polished axes, they look almost too beautiful to use. Were they all just tools?
That's a very good point. Some of them, especially those made from visually striking imported stone like jadeite, likely held more than just practical value. They might have been symbols of status, used in ceremonies, perhaps even exchanged as high-value gifts. We find them sometimes deposited in hoards or used as amulets.
So a whole new world where farming took root, permanent homes were built, and these incredible monumental tombs became central features of the landscape. But how did they actually think about life, death, their place in the world? What can we glean about their beliefs?
Well, their burial practices within these megalithic tombs give us some of our best clues. The communal nature of many tombs, the inclusion of specific types of grave goods like pottery, those polished stone mace heads or ceremonial balls, beads, amulets, pendants, even those enigmatic carved phallic stones found at Noth.
Right.
It all points towards complex belief systems surrounding death, the ancestors, and perhaps cycles of life, death, and rebirth, possibly connected to the agricultural cycle and the fertility of the land.
And the way they treated the bodies, both inhumation and cremation.
Yes, both inhumation, burying the intact body, and cremation, burning the body, were practiced, sometimes even within the same tomb, which is interesting. And there's also evidence suggesting the practice of excarnation.
Excarnation, what's that?
That's where the flesh was removed from the bones, perhaps through exposure to the elements, before the bones themselves were gathered for final burial in the tomb.
Complex rituals. And what about social structures? Did these tombs belong to chiefs or elites?
Well, the sheer scale of the monuments certainly implies a significant level of social organization and cooperation was needed to build them. Early interpretations often did focus on the idea of elite burials, particularly for the passage tombs.
But maybe not that simple.
More recent DNA analysis, particularly from sites like Pulnabrone, Portal Tomb, and some passage tombs, has revealed a more complex picture. It suggests that these tombs may have served broader communities, perhaps connected by kinship. The thinking is evolving maybe from smaller kin-based groups using the earlier tombs to potentially more diverse social units using the later, larger passage tombs.
And any sense of gender roles? You sometimes hear speculation.
Some researchers have speculated about the possibility of matriarchal social structures, perhaps based on the prominence of female figures in some interpretations of megalithic art or specific burial placements. But honestly, that remains a topic of ongoing debate and requires more evidence. It's difficult to project modern concepts back that far.
A truly fascinating glimpse into a world so different from ours, yet so foundational to everything that came after. And what came after, of course, was the age of metal, a real turning point, not just in Ireland, but globally.
Indeed. The Bronze Age, starting in Ireland around 2500 BC, brought with it the truly transformative power of metalworking, first copper and gold, then bronze itself. This new era of technology had profound and far-reaching effects on Irish society. It influenced everything from, trade and warfare to artistic expression and social hierarchy.
Pyrotechnology, resource management, it sounds like a whole new level of knowledge and skill was suddenly required.
Absolutely. The Bronze Age saw a significant leap forward in understanding and manipulating materials. Mastering fire, controlling heat pyrotechnology was key. Ireland actually became an important source for both copper, particularly in the southwest, and native gold, found in placer deposits.
But bronze was the real innovation.
Bronze was the game changer, yes. Developed around 2000 BC, it's an alloy, a mix of copper and tin. And the result was a metal significantly harder, more durable than copper, but crucially with a lower melting point, which made it easier to cast into complex shapes using molds.
But Ireland doesn't have much tin, does it?
No, not significant deposits. So this immediately necessitated the establishment of long-distance trade networks to acquire this crucial component. Most likely, the tin came from Cornwall, over in Britain.
So right away, we're seeing these early forms of international trade and connection driven by technology. And how did they actually get these metals, the copper anyway, out of the ground in the first place? Mining.
Bronze Age mining was a substantial undertaking, yes. We have significant evidence for it. Sites like Ross Island in County Kerry contain some of the earliest copper mines known anywhere in Western Europe, dating right back to the start of the Bronze Age, associated with beaker pottery users.
Mount Gabriel.
Mount Gabriel in County Cork is another major site. It has a whole complex network of shaft and adit mines dating back to the early to middle Bronze Age, maybe 1700, 1500 BC. They employed techniques like fire setting.
Fire setting.
Yeah, heating the rock face with fire, then rapidly cooling it with water to make it crack and become more brittle, easier to break up.
Clever.
Very. And then they'd use tools like heavy stone mauls and probably wooden wedges, antler picks, even wooden shovels. We found remains of alder shovels to actually extract the ore, which was then crushed and smelted, probably near the mines, often cast into ingots or cakes for easier transport.
It's incredible to think about the amount of labor, organization, and ingenuity involved in these early mining operations. And this control over metal resources, the mines, the smiths, it must have led to some significant changes in society itself.
It certainly seems that way. Control over these valuable resources, the copper, the gold, the tin routes, and also control over the specialized skills of the metalworkers, the smiths, who transformed these raw materials. It likely led to increased social stratification.
So elites emerging.
Probably, yes. An elite class seems to have emerged who controlled the production and distribution of metal goods. Weapons, tools, and especially the gold ornaments would have been highly prized symbols of status and power. We also see the development of more extensive trade networks, not just for tin, but also for other exotic materials like amber coming all the way from the Baltic region.
Amber from the Baltic, wow.
Yeah, it really shows the extent of these connections. And another thing we see, particularly in the late Bronze Age, is the increasing prevalence of weaponry swords, spearheads, shields found in hoards. This might suggest a rise in warfare, perhaps competition between different groups for resources or territory.
But it wasn't all about fighting. Metal helped farming, too.
Oh, definitely. It wasn't solely about conflict. The development of more efficient bronze tools, things like axes for clearing land, maybe even shares for ard plows, would have also led to greater efficiency in agriculture, potentially supporting population growth.
So a more complex, maybe more dynamic, possibly more hierarchical society emerging. And the way people lived, their settlements, their ritual practices, they also evolved during the Bronze Age, didn't they? We start seeing things like phylacteria and stone circles becoming much more common.
Yes, Bronze Age settlements included various types of enclosures and campsites. And phylacteria, they become incredibly numerous during this period, especially the Middle and Late Bronze Age.
Remind us what they are exactly.
They're those very common archaeological sites you see, often in wet areas, typically a horseshoe or crescent-shaped mound of burnt stones and charcoal found around a trough. The trough could be stone-lined or wood-lined, always near water and fuel.
And the main theory is cooking.
Yes. The prevailing theory is that they were primarily used for cooking. Essentially boiling meat in the water-filled trough, which was heated by dropping in stones heated in a nearby fire.
Like a big outdoor cooker.
Pretty much. Though other potential uses have been suggested too. Maybe bathing, dyeing textiles, softening leather, even brewing. There are thousands recorded across Ireland.
Amazing. And stone circles.
Stone circles, yes. Many of the stone circles we see in Ireland date to the Bronze Age. They clearly indicate the presence of important ritual and ceremonial activities. They vary a lot in size and complexity. Some, like Beltany in County Donegal, might span much of the Bronze Age. Others, like Drombeg in County Cork, seem more specifically Middle to Late Bronze Age, and interestingly, Drombeg has an associated Fulacht Fide and hut remains nearby.
Suggesting a link between ritual and maybe feasting or domestic life.
It certainly points to a blend of activities taking place in these locations, yes. Ritual, maybe communal gatherings, feasting perhaps.
And their burial traditions shifted again, didn't they? Moving away from those large communal Neolithic tombs for the most part.
Exactly. While the latest type of megalithic tomb, the wedge tomb, continued to be built and used right at the start of the early Bronze Age, we see the increasing adoption of a new burial rite. The cist burial.
Cists, stone boxes.
Essentially, yes. Individual or sometimes small group inhumations, unburnt bodies, placed in stone-lined graves, or cists. These were often covered by small cairns or earthen barrows. We find small cemeteries of these appearing during this period.
And do they have grave goods?
Yes, they often contain grave goods, things like the distinctive pottery known as food vessels, flint tools, and occasionally early bronze objects like dagger blades or awl.
And then later in the Bronze Age.
Later on, particularly in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, cremation becomes the dominant burial practice again. The cremated remains were placed inside pottery containers called cinerary urns.
Different types of urns.
Yes. Archaeologists classify them into various styles: vase urns, encrusted urns, collared urns, cordoned urns based on their shape and decoration. These urns were then buried in pits or sometimes within cists, occasionally placed upside down.
And sometimes those little extra pots.
Yes. Sometimes smaller, often more elaborately decorated pottery vessels known as incense cups or pygmy cups were included with these cremations. Their exact function is debated, maybe holding incense or a token portion of the remains. We're not entirely sure.
It's fascinating how burial practices keep evolving. And the treasures of the Bronze Age, I mean, the intricate goldwork, the sophisticated weaponry we see in museums, it's just breathtaking.
It truly is. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The early Bronze Age, say 2500 to 1500 BC, is known for its copper and then bronze flat axes, which gradually develop flanges. We also see early forms of daggers and tanged spearheads, and those really beautiful lunulae.
The thin gold collars.
Yes, thin crescent-shaped gold collars, often decorated with fine geometric incising. Over 50 have been found in Ireland. We also find gold discs from this period, maybe sun symbols, maybe dress ornaments.
And the Middle Bronze Age. Things developed from.
Yes, say 1500 down to maybe 900 BC. We see the development of more advanced bronze tools and weapons, like pawl staves, a type of axe, and elegant bronze rapiers, and more developed socketed spearheads. And goldwork really flourishes, including the appearance of the iconic gold torques, twisted bars, or ribbons of gold worn around the neck, appearing from about 1200 BC.
But the Late Bronze Age is where it really peaks.
You could argue that, yes, the Late Bronze Age, roughly 900 to 500 BC, seems to be a period of peak metal production. We see the emergence of classic leaf-shaped bronze swords, highly developed socketed spearheads, impressive sheet bronze shields, although maybe ceremonial. Socketed axes become common, plus specialized tools like gouges, chisels, sickles.
And big bronze vessels.
Yes, large bronze cauldrons and buckets made from riveted sheets of bronze, and even early musical instruments cast bronze horns. The technology was really advanced.
And the goldwork gets even more spectacular.
It does. The goldwork of the Late Bronze Age includes heavy solid gold bracelets, elaborate dress fasteners, often penannular or ring-shaped, with buffer terminals, the absolutely stunning Glenansheen gorget, a type of wide collar.
Incredible piece.
Isn't it? And various ear spools, necklaces made of hollow gold balls. Just amazing artistry and wealth.
And then there are the hoards, these massive collections of objects found buried together. What's the thinking behind those?
The hoards. They're one of the defining features of the Bronze Age, especially the later period. Like the massive Darius hoard from County Offaly, over 200 bronze objects, including tools, weapons, horns, cauldrons, or the Mood North hoard from County Clare, mostly gold ornaments, over 140 of them found together.
Why bury so much valuable stuff?
Well, that's the big question. Were they deliberately buried for self-keeping during times of conflict or instability, with the owner intending to retrieve them later? Or were they ritual depositions, votive offerings perhaps, maybe deposited in watery locations like bogs or rivers, which often seem to have held special significance?
Sacred waters?
Possibly. It's likely a combination of factors. Some might be concealed wealth, others might be offerings to gods or spirits. They're a real archaeological treasure trove, though, giving us invaluable snapshots of the range and quantity of metalwork being produced and used.
And these incredible artifacts, the lunulae, the torques, the hoards, they are, of course, housed safely in the National Museum of Ireland, aren't they? A must-see.
They are indeed. The National Museum in Dublin boasts a truly world-class collection of Bronze Age artifacts. Their gold collection is particularly significant, one of the best in Europe, and it's beautifully showcased in their permanent exhibition, Or Ireland's Gold. It's an absolutely essential resource for anyone wanting to truly understand this pivotal metal-rich era in Irish history.
Absolutely. So from the captivating gleam of gold and the utility of bronze, our journey through time continues, moving into the Iron Age, a period often closely linked with the arrival of new people, new technologies, and those distinctive Celtic influences.
That's right. The Iron Age, which we generally date from around 500 BC in Ireland, marks another really significant cultural transformation. We see the gradual introduction and adoption of iron technology and the increasing influence of what we broadly understand as Celtic artistic styles and societal elements, primarily coming from continental Europe.
Iron now, it's my understanding that iron ore is actually much more readily available in the landscape than copper and tin were. Did its arrival sort of democratize metal use?
That's a good way to think about it. The adoption of iron wasn't an overnight thing, it was a gradual process. While there's some early evidence suggesting a knowledge of ironworking maybe as early as the 8th century BC, it wasn't really until around the 3rd century BC that a distinct Iron Age society, characterized by the widespread use of iron for tools and weapons, fully seems to emerge in Ireland.
Okay.
And yes, iron ore was indeed more abundant and easier to find than the copper and tin needed to make bronze. This likely did have a significant impact on who could access and utilize metal tools and weapons. It potentially made metal less exclusive, more available beyond just the absolute elite.
And this is the period when we start talking about the Celts. Now, that's a term that can be quite complex and debated by scholars, isn't it? It's not as simple as a single Celtic invasion.
It is indeed a very complex term, and you're right. The idea of a single Celtic invasion is largely discredited now. When archaeologists and historians use the term Celt, it's important to understand we're not necessarily talking about a large-scale migration of a single, unified ethnic group arriving suddenly in Ireland.
So what does it mean then?
Instead, Celt is often used as a broad label to refer to various peoples across a wide swath of Europe who shared certain linguistic traits, the Celtic language's specific artistic styles, like Latin art, and maybe some social customs or religious ideas. Think of it a bit like how we might talk about Western culture today. It covers a lot of different groups and places, but with some shared characteristics.
Okay, that makes sense.
In Ireland, we see some influences from the earlier Hallstatt culture of the continental Iron Age, but much more prominently from the later Latin culture, which really takes hold from around the 3rd century BC onwards. This Celtic arrival in Ireland was likely a much more gradual and complex process, probably a combination of cultural diffusion through trade and contact, maybe smaller movements of people or influential groups, and very likely local elites adopting these new fashionable styles and ideas coming from Europe. It wasn't a single event, but rather a centuries-long process of Ireland becoming integrated into a wider European cultural sphere. And the adoption of Latin art is a key archaeological marker of this integration.
And Latin art is so instantly recognizable, isn't it? Those beautiful, abstract, flowing curves and spirals. What are some of its key characteristics as it appears specifically in Ireland?
Irish Latin art is just stunning. It's primarily abstract, as you say, and characterized by these flowing, curvilinear designs. You see elegant curves, expanding spirals, distinctive S-scrolls, trumpet-shaped ends where lines flare out, the swirling three-armed triskel motif, raised bumps or lentoid bosses, and also stylized representations of plants woven into the designs.
Any animals?
Yes, it often incorporates zoomorphic elements, animal forms, but usually highly stylized. Particularly common are bird heads, often appearing at the ends of spirals or scrolls. Unlike, say, classical Greek or Roman art, it's generally non-narrative. It doesn't typically depict specific scenes or stories. And there's a notable, though not exclusive, focus on the human head as a motif, but rarely the full human form.
And what was it made on? Metal, mostly.
We find this art expressed mainly in metalwork, beautiful pieces in bronze, gold, and sometimes iron, and to a lesser extent in some remarkable examples of stone sculpture. While it shares a common origin with Tène art found across Celtic Europe, the Irish version developed its own distinct regional characteristics. It showed a remarkable indigenous dynamism, and elements of the style actually endured and influenced the later insular art tradition of the early medieval period.
Can you give us some iconic examples, pieces people might have seen pictures of or seen in the museum?
Oh, certainly. For metalwork, there's the Ardnaglug collar from County Roscommon. It's actually made of imported gold, but worked in an early Tène style here. Then there's the Braider hoard from County Derry, just breathtaking. It includes the magnificent gold Braider collar, or torque, that delicate little gold model boat, and a decorated bronze cauldron.
The little boat is amazing.
Isn't it just? Then you have the so-called Petrie crown, which is actually a bronze headdress. Beautifully decorated sword scabbards like the tomb scabbard covered in intricate spirals, and various highly ornamented bronze dress fasteners, pins, brooches. The craftsmanship is superb.
And in stone.
In stone sculpture, the Turo stone in County Galway is probably the most famous. It's a granite pillar completely covered in those flowing curvilinear Tène patterns. And the enigmatic three-faced Corlick head from County Cavan is another key piece. Very powerful imagery.
Truly impressive artistic achievements. And what about how people were living and organizing themselves during this Iron Age? We start to see the emergence of these really significant royal sites and large, impressive hill forts.
Yes, the Iron Age in Ireland seems to have seen a further consolidation of tribal power and the rise of what are often referred to as royal sites. These were large, important ceremonial and political centers, possibly associated with regional kingships or later high kingships mentioned in myths and legends.
Like Tara.
Exactly. Tara in County Meath is the most famous, but also Emain Macha, or Novan Fort, near Armagh, Dun Éilin in County Kildare, Rathcrogan or Cruangai in County Roscommon, and Usnich in County Westmeath. Many of these sites actually have origins stretching back into the Bronze Age or even Neolithic, but they seem to reach their zenith of importance during the Iron Age. They often feature massive enclosures, evidence of large timber structures, perhaps for feasting or ritual.
And hill forts, too. Big defensive sites.
Yes, alongside the royal sites, we see the construction of numerous hill forts across the country. These are typically large defended enclosures ranging from maybe 1 to 40 acres, though often around 5-10 acres. Usually located on prominent hilltops, enclosed by substantial earthen banks and ditches or sometimes stone ramparts. They likely served as important tribal centers, maybe residences for chiefs or other elites, and also as places of refuge or assembly for the wider community in times of threat. Gregianan of Aileach up in Donegal is a spectacular restored example, and Mugan down in County Clare was enormous.
And what about the everyday farmer? Where were they living?
Well, the familiar ring forts, those circular enclosures known as raths or lyoses, really become the most numerous type of monument on the landscape during this period and into the early medieval. There are over 40,000 recorded.
40,000?
Incredible number. They're generally interpreted as enclosed farmsteads, home to extended families and their livestock. Usually 20-40 meters across, defined by earthen banks and ditches, a rath, or a stone wall, a cashel, more common in the West. Many also have associated souterrains underground passages likely used for storage or refuge.
And people still lived on lakes, too.
Yes, crannogs, those artificial or enhanced natural islands in lakes, continued to be built and occupied. They offered good defense and sometimes seemed to indicate a higher social status for their occupants. Their use spans from the late Bronze Age right through the Iron Age and into the medieval period.
And one more type, promontory forts.
Promontory forts, yes, found on coastal headlands or inland cliff edges. They utilized the natural defenses on 2 or 3 sides, with artificial banks and ditches cutting off the neck of land. Occupation evidence inside them is sometimes sparse, leading to debate about their function. Were they permanent settlements, temporary refuges, or perhaps primarily ceremonial or ritual sites? Probably a mix, depending on the site.
So a society that appears to be becoming more hierarchical, perhaps more focused on defense and territorial control. And then there are the incredibly preserved bog bodies that have been discovered. That's a really haunting and unique aspect of the Irish Iron Age, isn't it?
Indeed. The discovery of these remarkably well-preserved human remains in peat bogs is a very striking and somewhat uniquely Irish and Northern European feature of the Iron Age. The anaerobic, oxygen-free, and acidic conditions within the bogs acted as amazing natural preservatives, tanning the skin, preserving hair, sometimes even internal organs.
But they often died violently.
Yes, what's particularly notable and often disturbing is that these individuals frequently show clear signs of violent death. They might have been stabbed, strangled, decapitated, or received massive blows to the head. And they're often found naked or with very little clothing, maybe just an arm ring or a cap.
Which suggests ritual killing.
It has certainly led to various interpretations, including the strong possibility of ritual sacrifice. Perhaps these individuals were offerings to gods or spirits believed to inhabit these liminal, watery places. Or maybe they were executions of criminals or high-status hostages, disposed of in a specific way outside normal burial practices. Bogs might have been seen as thresholds between worlds, suitable places for such depositions.
It really makes you wonder about the beliefs and the maybe darker ritual practices of the time. Can you tell us about some of the more well-known bog body discoveries in Ireland?
Well, Old Crogan Man, found in County Offaly, is one of the most famous. He dates from between 362 and 175 BC. He was exceptionally tall for his time. His hands were remarkably well manicured, suggesting he didn't do heavy manual labor, possibly high status.
And how did he die?
The manner of his death was incredibly brutal. He was stabbed, decapitated, his body cut in half across the torso, and he had distinctive cuts beneath his nipples. His last meal included cereals and buttermilk. The location of his discovery, near Crogan Hill, a known ancient site associated with kingship inauguration.
Oh,
It all strongly suggests a ritualistic killing. Perhaps he was a king or a chieftain who was sacrificed, maybe for a perceived failure. It's chillingly evocative of later descriptions of sovereignty rituals.
goodness. Any others?
Galaman, found in County Galway, dates a bit earlier, 470-120 BC. He was found with a withy hoop, a sort of twisted wooden collar around his neck indicating strangulation, and his body was pinned down in the bog by wooden stakes. Then there's Cloney Cavan Man from County Meath, living between 392 and 201 BC. He had this distinctive hairstyle, sort of a Mohican, held up with a kind of gel made from plant oil and pine resin.
Imported hair gel.
The resin likely had to be imported, possibly from France or Spain, which again suggests status. He suffered multiple axe blows to the head and was disemboweled. These discoveries offer a gruesome but incredibly valuable and direct insight into the complex, sometimes violent, aspects of Iron Age life, death, and belief.
It's chilling, but absolutely fascinating. It's a direct window into their world. And the National Museum, I believe, houses some of these remarkable remains alongside the beautiful Tène art.
Yes, absolutely. The National Museum of Ireland in Dublin is the repository for a hugely significant collection of Iron Age artifacts. You can see the stunning Tène decorated metalwork there, the Brader hoard artifacts, the collars, the scabbards, bronze discs, pins, everything. A wide range of personal ornaments, weapons, iron swords start becoming more common, though bronze is still used decoratively feasting equipment like cauldrons, the intriguing carved stone pieces like the Corlac head.
The bog bodies.
And yes, the preserved remains of Old Crogan Man, Cloney Cavan Man, and Galaman, among others, are displayed in a very sensitive and informative way. They also hold evidence of Ireland's interaction with the Roman world during this period, imported Roman goods found at certain sites.
Contact with the Romans, that's an interesting point to consider as we transition. Because even though Ireland itself wasn't conquered by Rome, their influence was felt nearby. And that brings us into the early medieval period, a time of immense spiritual and intellectual change in Ireland with the coming of Christianity.
Absolutely. The early medieval period in Ireland, which we generally date from around 8400 up to the beginning of the Norman invasions, around AD 1169, though the Viking Age is a distinct phase within that marks a truly pivotal transition. It's defined by the establishment and flourishing of a really unique and vibrant Irish Christian culture.
St. Patrick is, of course, the figure most famously associated with this profound shift, isn't he? Kicking it all off.
He is indeed the figure traditionally credited with the widespread introduction, or at least consolidation, of Christianity in Ireland, usually dated to the mid-5th century. However, it's important to remember, as with most big historical changes, the conversion was actually a gradual process that likely unfolded over several centuries. It wasn't just one man, one moment.
Right.
And Irish Christian culture developed its own very distinctive character. It cleverly blended elements of the new faith with existing Celtic beliefs, artistic traditions, and even social structures. Monasteries became the absolute central pillars of this emerging Christian society.
More than just places of worship.
Oh, much more. They served not only as places of worship, but also as vital centers of learning and literacy, preserving classical knowledge when it was being lost elsewhere in Europe. They were centers for the production of stunning illuminated manuscripts, like the Book of Kells, and incredible works of skilled crafts, particularly metalwork. They were also major economic centers.
And these early Irish monasteries, I understand they had a very different feel and layout compared to, say, the big Benedictine monasteries on the continent. More scattered.
Yes, that's a key feature. Early Irish monasteries often had a distinctive and somewhat less formally planned layout compared to their continental counterparts. They were typically enclosed by a circular wall or bank, known as a cashel, if stone, or rath, if earthen, clearly borrowing from the pre-existing ring fort tradition.
Interesting continuity.
It is, and within these enclosures you wouldn't necessarily find the rigidly ordered cloisters of later European monasteries. Instead, you'd find maybe several small stone or wooden churches referred to as iglas, or timpal. Individual monks' cells, sometimes those small circular dry stone beehive huts called clotions, particularly in the West, or simple wooden structures, plus refectories for eating, scriptoriums where manuscripts were painstakingly written and illuminated, schools, workshops for various crafts, and agricultural buildings like barns and mills.
And later additions.
Yes, later in this period, those iconic round towers and the elaborately carved high crosses become prominent features of the major monastic landscapes. Famous sites like Glendalough, associated with St. Kevin, or Clonmacnoise on the Shannon, founded by St. Cyran, beautifully exemplify this unique, often sprawling monastic landscape.
Round towers, those tall, slender stone sentinels that you still see dotting the Irish countryside. They looked defensive. What was their actual purpose? Was it just defense against Vikings?
Well, the precise purpose of round towers has been the subject of a lot of debate over the years among historians and archaeologists. They were built primarily between the 10th and 12th centuries AD, which, yes, definitely coincided with the period of most intense Viking activity. So defense was almost certainly a factor.
How so?
They're very sturdy construction. The fact that the doorway is typically raised several meters above ground level, you'd need a ladder to get in, which could be pulled up.
Clever.
Exactly. And the narrow slit windows higher up, it all suggests a defensive role, offering a lookout point and, crucially, a place of refuge, a strong room for monks, and, perhaps more importantly, for valuable religious objects like illuminated manuscripts and metalwork reliquaries during raids.
But maybe not just defense.
It's now generally accepted that they likely served multiple functions. They almost certainly also function as belfries. The Irish name is cloitrach, meaning bell house used to call the monastic community to prayer. And they were undoubtedly powerful symbols of the monastery's importance, its power and prestige within the local landscape, visible for miles around. So probably a combination of defense, belfry, and status symbol.
Makes sense. We have, what, over 65 surviving examples?
At least that many, yes, in various states of preservation. The tower at Kilmacduagh, County Galway, is the tallest leaning tower in Ireland, maybe Europe. Other really notable examples include the two fine round towers at Clonmacnoise, the one at Glendalough, and the beautiful one on Devonish Island in Lough.
And the high crosses, you mentioned those two. Those incredibly intricately carved stone monuments. They were far more than just simple religious symbols marking a spot, weren't they? They looked like teaching tools.
Absolutely. You could call them sermons in stone. High crosses were truly impressive works of art, but they also served vital functions in communicating biblical narratives, theological ideas, and underpinning the power and authority of the church within the wider community. They functioned as both spiritual focal points and prominent territorial markers within the landscape.
When were they mostly made?
These crosses date primarily from the 8th through to the 12th centuries. They're characterized by their often intricate carvings and frequently that distinctive ringed shape around the intersection of the arms and shaft.
The Celtic cross ring. What's the thinking on that?
The symbolism of the ring itself is still debated by scholars. Is it purely structural, helping support the arms? Does it represent a halo? The sun, linking perhaps to pre-Christian symbolism? A celestial sphere? Or maybe even a representation of a bishop's shield or authority? Probably a mix of meanings evolved over time.
And the carvings. They tell stories.
They do, especially the later ones. The carvings themselves evolved. Early crosses might feature more abstract interlaced patterns, spirals, animal motifs drawing on that earlier Latin tradition. But the later so-called scripture crosses are covered in panels depicting biblical scenes, Old Testament stories, the life of Christ, the Last Judgment. Sometimes also scenes of saints' lives or depictions of contemporary ecclesiastics, maybe the patrons who commissioned the cross. Some even have inscriptions in Irish.
So what was their purpose overall?
They likely served multiple purposes. Visual aids for religious instruction, as we said, crucial for a largely illiterate population. They might have been focal points for liturgical activities, like outdoor prayer stations or stops during religious processions. Definitely used for commemoration, marking the burial place of important saints, founders, or patrons, or just celebrating the monastery itself. They were potent symbols of monastic authority and land ownership, sometimes acting almost like boundary markers, defining the sacred precinct or monastic lands.
Where can we see some of the best examples?
Oh, there are many stunning examples. Muiredach's Cross and the West Cross at Monasteries in County Louth are famous scripture crosses. The Cross of the Scriptures at Clonmacnoise is another major one. The Moonhigh Cross in County Kildare has very distinctive, almost abstract, figural carvings. And for an earlier example showing that fascinating blend of Christian and possibly pre-Christian motifs, the Carndonagh Cross in County Donegal is very important.
So a landscape increasingly defined by these impressive stone structures, towers and crosses serving both spiritual and practical, maybe political purposes. And then we have something else made of stone. The Ogham stones, our earliest tangible evidence of the written Irish language itself.
Yes, Ogham stones are incredibly important. They represent a crucial step in the transition to literacy in Ireland, and they provide us with the earliest direct contemporary evidence of the Irish language, what linguists call primitive Irish.
And the script itself is unique, isn't it? Lines and notches.
It is unique. It's an alphabetic script, but instead of letters like ours, it uses a system of strokes and notches carved along a central stem line. Usually the stem line is simply the natural edge or eris of the upright stone pillar itself.
Clever use of the material. When do they date from?
The vast majority of Ogham inscriptions date from the 4th to the 6th, maybe early 7th centuries AD, so straddling that period when Christianity was taking root.
And what do they actually say? What was their function?
Their primary function appears to have been commemorative, marking the burials or at least commemorating individuals, probably high-status men within the tribal society of the time. The inscriptions typically record the name of the deceased, usually in the genitive case meaning of so-and-so, often followed by the formula MAQI, meaning son of, and then the father's name. Sometimes they trace the lineage back even further to a grandfather or tribal ancestor.
So, like genealogical marker.
Exactly. Lineage and belonging were clearly very important. We have over 400 surviving Ogham stones recorded in Ireland, with the highest concentration by far in the southwest counties, Kerry, Cork, Waterford. But they're also found elsewhere, and significantly, in areas of Irish settlement over in Britain, particularly Wales and Scotland.
And their connection to Christian sites.
It's interesting, many Ogham stones are found in close proximity to early ecclesiastical sites, suggesting they were respected, maybe even incorporated into the Christian landscape. Some stones even have later Christian cross inscriptions carved onto them, suggesting a continued relevance or perhaps a reinterpretation of these ancient monuments within a Christian context. We also find Ogham script occasionally used on portable objects, like the inscription on the 9th century Ballyspellin brooch. Linguistically, these stones are absolutely invaluable, providing a direct link to the earliest recorded stages of the Irish language.
A tangible connection to the ancestors and the very beginnings of written Irish. Now, no discussion of early medieval Ireland would be complete, as you mentioned, without considering the arrival and impact of the Vikings, a disruptive but also transformative force.
Indeed. The Viking Age in Ireland, which traditionally spans from the first recorded raids in AD 795 right up to the Norman arrival in 1169, had a profound and lasting impact on the island. It began, as you say, quite disruptively.
The raids on monasteries.
Yes. The earliest phase, from AD 795, consisted mainly of hit-and-run raids, primarily targeting the wealthy monasteries for their portable valuables, precious metalwork, maybe high-status captives for ransom or slavery.
Must have been terrifying.
For those communities, absolutely.
Yeah.
But then, from around AD 840 onwards, we see a significant shift. The Vikings started establishing Longfurt.
Longfurt. What were they?
These were fortified bases or winter camps established initially on the coasts and along navigable rivers. Sites like Dublin, Annagassan, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick started this way. These Longfurt marked a crucial change from just short-term seasonal raiding to more extended periods of activity, including overwintering in Ireland. And over time, the people associated with these bases weren't just raiders. They also became skilled craftspeople, merchants, traders, and eventually settlers.
So they brought change.
Yes, introducing new technologies, different economic systems focused on trade and silver, new types of material culture. And this led to significant cultural exchange and ultimately the emergence of a distinctive Hiberno-Norse culture, particularly in the towns they founded.
Those initial Viking raids on the monasteries, though they must have been incredibly disruptive for those centers of learning and wealth.
They certainly were. The monasteries, being relatively undefended centers of wealth and often located in accessible coastal or riverside locations, were prime targets for Viking raiders. These raids undoubtedly caused significant disruption, fear, and in some cases, the destruction of important religious sites and the loss of invaluable treasures and manuscripts. However, as we said, by the mid-9th century, the establishment of Longfruit indicated a change in Viking strategy, moving towards a more sustained presence and interaction with Ireland, not just plunder.
It was from these Longfruit that the first true towns in Ireland, like Dublin and Waterford, eventually developed, didn't they? A major Viking legacy.
Exactly. This is one of the most significant long-term impacts of the Vikings in Ireland. By the 10th century AD, many of these defended Longfruit had evolved into Ireland's first proper urban centers. They became crucial hubs for international trade, craft production, and political power within their region.
And Dublin was the big one.
Dublin, or Difflin, as the Vikings probably called it, founded as a Longfruit around AD 841, quickly became the most important of these settlements. It developed into a major trade center, strategically located within the thriving Irish Sea trade zone. The archaeological excavations carried out in Dublin, particularly at sites like Woodquay and Fishamble Street back in the 70s and 80s, were revolutionary.
What did they find?
They provided absolutely remarkable insights into the layout and daily life of the 10th and 11th century Hiberno-Norse town. They uncovered evidence of densely packed rectangular houses built with post and wattle walls and thatched roofs, lining gravel and log-paved streets. They found property boundaries marked by fences, numerous workshops for crafts like metalworking, antler comb making, leatherworking, and just a staggering wealth of artifacts reflecting everyday urban life clothes, shoes, tools, games, musical instruments.
An entire preserved townscape.
Pretty much, yes. And other significant Hiberno-Norse towns that developed from Viking bases include Waterford, Derafjord, Wexford, Visafjordflir, Limerick, Limericker, and Cork. More recent work near Waterford uncovered Woodstown, a large defended Viking settlement from the mid-9th century, possibly an earlier raiding base.
So the Vikings weren't just raiders and pillagers. They were also skilled craftspeople, international traders, and ultimately Ireland's first town planners, significantly reshaping the Irish landscape and economy. What kind of impact did they have on Irish culture more broadly, beyond the towns?
Well, the towns were major centers, but their influence spread. As we saw from the Dublin excavations, they were indeed skilled craftspeople. We have evidence of sophisticated woodworking bowls, furniture, ship timbers, often decorated in later periods with Scandinavian art styles like ringerike. They excelled at metalworking too, iron tools, knives, locks, but also fine work in bronze, silver, and gold, evidenced by finds of molds and ingots.
Other crafts.
Yes, working amber, jet, and glass to create beads and pendants. Textile production is shown by finds of wool combs, spindle whorls, loom weights, and intricate carving in bone and antler to produce things like decorative combs and gaming pieces.
And trade. You mentioned trade.
Trade was fundamental to these towns. Silver became the primary medium of exchange, often in the form of hack silver, chopped up pieces of Arabic, Anglo-Saxon, or other silver coins and ornaments, weighed out for transactions. Then, around AD 997, we see the first indigenous Irish coins being minted, significantly in Dublin, by the Hiberno-Norse king Sitric Silkbeard silver pennies modeled on English types.
So they integrated into wider economies.
Absolutely. And they imported goods too, specific types of pottery from England and the continent, soapstone vessels from Scandinavia and Scotland. Their influence also extended to the Irish language, particularly with words related to shipping, trade, fishing, and town life having Norse origins. They undoubtedly influenced shipbuilding techniques, maybe even agricultural practices in the areas around the towns.
Did they remain separate, or did they integrate?
Over time, there was significant integration. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, the Hiberno-Norse populations in the towns had largely converted to Christianity. This led to a unique cultural fusion, particularly evident in the art and structure of the towns themselves.
And the famous Battle of Clontarf in 1014 that's often portrayed as the big showdown, the end of Viking power in Ireland, isn't it? Brian Boru defeating the Vikings.
The Battle of Clontarf, fought near Dublin in 1014 between the forces led by the Irish High King Brian Boru and a coalition including the Viking King of Dublin, Sitric Silkbeard, along with allies from Leinster and Vikings from overseas, is indeed a hugely significant event in Irish history. It's traditionally been portrayed, as you say, as a major Irish victory that decisively curtailed Viking power.
But maybe it's more complicated.
Modern historical understanding is definitely more nuanced. While it was a victory for Brian Boru's side, although Brian himself was famously killed in the aftermath, it's now seen as being just as much, if not more, about internal Irish power struggles. It was essentially Brian Boru asserting his authority over the Kingdom of Leinster and its ally, the Hiberno-Norse Kingdom of Dublin. There were Vikings fighting on both sides of the battle.
Ah, okay.
So while the battle did undoubtedly weaken the independent military power of Dublin, it didn't lead to the immediate end of Viking presence or influence in Ireland. The Hiberno-Norse towns like Dublin, Waterford, Limerick continued to thrive as important economic centers for centuries afterwards. Viking cultural influences persisted and were increasingly integrated into the fabric of Irish society. It wasn't a simple Irish versus Viking clash.
So a much more intricate picture than just a straightforward victory of the native Irish over foreign invaders. And artistically, you mentioned that fascinating Hiberno-Norse fusion emerging during this later period. What did that look like?
Absolutely. From the late 8th century onwards, really, we begin to see elements of a distinct Hiberno-Norse artistic style developing, which blended the established, intricate insular art traditions of Ireland with the bolder animal styles and interlacing patterns introduced by the Vikings.
And this peaked later.
Yes. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Irish ecclesiastical metalwork in particular shows really significant influence from contemporary Scandinavian art styles, particularly the ringeric and urn styles. These are characterized by elongated, ribbon-like animal forms, tendrils, and complex interlacing patterns. This fusion of artistic traditions produced some truly magnificent objects, real masterpieces of European medieval art. Things like the elaborately decorated croziers, bishop's staffs, like the crozier of Kells or the Lismore crozier, intricately worked bell shrines, created to house the revered iron bells of early saints, like St. Patrick's Bell Shrine. Book shrines or cumdachs made to encase precious manuscripts, like the shrine for the Cathach of St. Columba. Impressive processional crosses, like the majestic Cross of Cong from the 12th century, and various other beautiful reliquaries like St. Lactan's Arm Shrine.
These are truly some of the greatest artistic treasures, not just of Ireland, but of medieval Europe. And the National Museum once again plays that vital role in preserving and showcasing the artifacts from this fascinating period of conflict, interaction, and artistic fusion.
Indeed. The National Museum of Ireland holds absolutely outstanding collections from both the native Irish early medieval period and the Viking Age. You can see iconic early Christian treasures there like the Ardagh Chalice and the Daire na Flan Hoard, alongside a huge wealth of artifacts recovered from Viking burial sites like the amazing finds from Kilmainham and Island Bridge in Dublin, and of course from the urban excavations in Dublin, Waterford, and other Viking-founded towns. Their Viking Ireland exhibition offers a fantastic opportunity to really immerse yourself in the material culture of this transformative era.
Definitely worth a visit.
Yeah.
So from the era of monastic learning and Viking longships, our journey through Irish archaeological history now takes us firmly into the medieval period proper, a time marked by another hugely significant arrival, that of the Normans, and another wave of profound and lasting changes across the island.
Exactly. The Norman arrival in Ireland, starting effectively in 1169, represents another major watershed moment in Irish history and archaeology. It led to a significant and often quite traumatic transformation of the Irish landscape. It brought the introduction of entirely new forms of architecture, new settlement patterns, fundamentally different land ownership systems, and new socioeconomic structures linked to feudalism.
And the sudden appearance of castles all over the landscape must have been one of the most visible and immediately impactful changes brought by the Normans, right? A very clear statement of power.
Absolutely. Castles are the defining monument type of the Norman period in Ireland. Initially facing resistance, the Normans rapidly constructed hundreds of motte and bailey castles.
The earth and timber ones.
Yes, those characteristic earthen mounds, the motte topped with a wooden tower or keep, and usually accompanied by an enclosed courtyard, the bailey, defended by a palisade and ditch. They were relatively quick and easy to build using local resources and served as immediate centers of control and defense in newly conquered territories.
But they didn't stick with wood for long.
No. Over time, particularly from the early 13th century onwards, these were gradually replaced or augmented by much more formidable stone castles. This included building impressive stone keeps or towers on top of existing moats, or sometimes enclosing the motte top with a stone wall, creating a shell keep. And increasingly, they built large enclosure castles defined by strong curtain walls with projecting mural towers, often round or D-shaped, and imposing gatehouses. Places like Trim Castle, Carrickfergus Castle, Roscommon Castle are great examples of this mature Norman military architecture. It reflects a much more permanent and assertive establishment of Norman power and influence. Sometimes they built huge rectangular stone keeps too, called donjons or hall keeps, like at Athenry or Ferns.
So the landscape is physically changing with these massive stone structures. And monastic life also underwent significant changes, didn't it, with the introduction and expansion of these big continental religious orders?
Yes, that's another huge impact of the Norman period. While Ireland had its own flourishing monastic tradition, the Normans actively introduced and heavily patronized religious orders that followed continental European rules and organizational structures. Orders like the Cistercians, who first arrived in 1142 at Mellifont, the Augustinians, and later the Mendicant Friars, the Franciscans and Dominicans were established or saw significant expansion across Ireland, particularly in areas under Norman control.
And they built big.
They did. They established large and influential abbeys and friaries, often with quite distinctive architectural styles based on their European mother houses. These played a crucial role not only in religious life, but also heavily influenced the economic and social fabric of medieval Ireland. The Cistercians in particular were renowned for their efficient land management practices, establishing large agricultural estates called granges, often focused on sheep farming for wool and grain production. They really reshaped large tracts of the countryside. Jerpoint Abbey, Boyle Abbey, Dunbrody Abbey are classic Cistercian sites. The friars tended to establish houses in the growing towns.
And towns themselves, the Normans seem to have really focused on developing and controlling towns.
Indeed. While the Vikings had established the first towns, the Normans really consolidated and expanded urban life in Ireland. They actively founded new towns and boroughs and significantly developed the existing Hiberno-Norse port towns like Dublin and Waterford, bringing them more formally under royal control. They often granted these towns royal charters, which provided specific legal structures, rights to hold markets and fairs, and commercial privileges, encouraging trade and settlement.
And they fortified them.
Yes, these towns were frequently planned with a more organized layout than might have existed before, and crucially, they were often enclosed by substantial defensive walls. Initially, maybe just earth and timber banks, but increasingly rebuilt in stone throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, often with funding assistance from the crown through specific taxes called mirage grants. These impressive town walls, often featuring gatehouses and projecting mural towers, became defining features of places like Kilkenny, Drogheda, Athenry, Fethard. These walled towns were vital centers for trade, administration, and the assertion of Norman military and political control.
Then, a bit later in the medieval period, we see the really widespread construction of tower houses, those very distinctive, tall, fortified residences that are just so common, even as ruins, in the Irish landscape today. What was driving their appearance?
Yes, the tower house phenomenon is fascinating. Their construction became particularly widespread from around the late 14th, early 15th century onwards, and they continued to be built and lived in right up into the early 17th century, so spanning the later medieval and into the early post-medieval period.
Who was building them?
They were built by both Gaelic Irish lords and the increasingly Gaelicized Hiberno-Norman aristocracy. Their rise seems to coincide with a period of Gaelic resurgence and a more fragmented political landscape, where central authority, whether English or native Irish, was weaker. They served primarily as relatively small-scale local defensive structures, providing security for their occupants, the local lordly family, and their retainers, and control over their immediate territory.
So more about local defense than big campaigns?
Exactly. The tower house evolved into a kind of vernacular fortified building form. It represents, in a way, a decentralization of military power, with a focus shifting to personal security and local lordship. They typically consisted of a tall, slender, rectangular stone tower, usually 3 to 5 stories high, with a relatively small footprint compared to the earlier, larger castles, often accompanied by a walled courtyard or enclosure called a bawn.
Thousands of them were built, weren't they?
Estimates suggest over 2,000, maybe many more, were built across Ireland. Many survive today, either as ruins or restored, like Bunratty or Onanur. There was even a £10 subsidy offered by the English government in 1429 for building them within the Pale, hoping to encourage defense, which might have boosted numbers there.
Fascinating. And beyond these more prominent castles and tower houses, what can archaeology tell us about rural settlement more generally? How did the average person live in the countryside during the medieval period under Norman influence?
Well, the Norman introduction of the manorial system significantly influenced rural settlement patterns and land use, particularly in the areas they controlled most strongly, the east and south. A typical manor was essentially a landed estate held by a lord. It often coincided with a parish boundary. Usually it had a central point, the caput, which might include the lord's residence, maybe a motte and bailey initially, later a stone castle or manor house, the parish church, a mill, maybe a dovecote.
And the land was divided up.
Yes. The manor's land was typically divided into the lord's domain, the land he farmed directly using tenant labor and the tenant holdings, which were farmed by free or unfree tenants who owed rent, services, or both to the lord. If the manor included a borough, there would also be burgesses holding plots within the town.
Did this completely replace older patterns?
While the manorial system brought significant changes in terms of land tenure and social structure, there was also often a degree of continuity with pre-Norman settlement patterns. Manorial centers were sometimes established at existing important ecclesiastical sites or earlier high-status settlements. We also see, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries, the appearance of hundreds of moated sites across the countryside.
Moated sites, like mini castles.
Not usually that grand. They're typically rectangular enclosures surrounded by a substantial water-filled ditch or moat and an internal earthen bank. Inside, there would have been timber or perhaps stone buildings. They seem to have been the residences of more prosperous tenants, maybe lower-ranking gentry or substantial freeholders, often located some distance away from the main nucleated village or manorial center. They suggest a degree of dispersed settlement among the more comfortable farming class.
And how did agriculture itself and the overall economy evolve during the medieval period in Ireland? Was it all just subsistence farming?
Medieval agriculture in Ireland was generally a mixed system, involving both the cultivation of crops and the raising of livestock, particularly cattle, which remained a really important measure of wealth, especially in Gaelic areas. However, there was a trend from the early medieval period onwards towards a greater emphasis on grain production, particularly oats and wheat. This seems to have intensified under the Normans, especially in the east and south, where they introduced more systematic arable farming practices, like the open field system with strip cultivation and crop rotation.
New crops, too.
Yes, evidence suggests they introduced or expanded the cultivation of crops like peas, beans, celery, onions. They also established rabbit warrens. Rabbits weren't native, and dovecotes as managed sources of meat and eggs. Water mills for grinding grain became much more common and efficient. And fishing, often using large V-shaped river weirs, continued to play an important role in the economy alongside farming.
And the material culture of the time, the everyday objects people use, it must also reflect these changes and influences, mustn't it? Like the pottery they used or the money?
Yes, absolutely. We see significant developments in material culture that archaeology uncovers. Pottery is a great example. The potter's wheel seems to have been a Norman introduction, arriving in the 13th century. This allowed for the faster production of more symmetrical vessels.
So more pots around.
Yes, pottery becomes much more common in the archaeological record from this period onwards. Both locally produced wares and imported pottery from England and France are found, including jugs, cooking pots, and tableware, often glazed, with green glaze being particularly common on the locally made Leinster cookingware, for instance.
And money.
The use of coinage, primarily silver pennies modeled on English currency, became much more widespread, facilitating trade and rent payments. We find coin hoards from this period reflecting the developing monetary economy. Metalwork continued to be an important craft, producing secular items like jewelry brooches, ring brooches, tools, and weaponry found in excavations. And of course, the production of elaborate ecclesiastical objects continued, with existing shrines and reliquaries often being venerated, remodeled, or added to throughout the medieval period. New types of religious items also appeared, like wooden statues or embroidered vestments like the Waterford cope. The National Museum's medieval galleries really bring this rich material culture to life.
Which brings us towards the end of the strictly medieval period and into the post-medieval and modern eras. This is a time from around 1550 onwards that saw further dramatic shifts, political upheaval, colonial policies, plantations, new architectural styles, again, early industrialization, conflicts, and archaeology continues to be crucial in understanding all of this, right up to the present day.
Absolutely. The post-medieval period, from around 1550 onwards, and the subsequent modern era, were characterized by immense political, social, and cultural upheaval in Ireland. Key drivers include the implementation of English colonial policies, particularly the plantation schemes aimed at dispossessing native Irish and settling British Protestants. This period also saw the introduction of new architectural styles reflecting Renaissance and later influences, the beginnings of industrialization, numerous devastating military conflicts, and of course, the development of modern archaeological practice itself as a discipline for studying all these pasts.
The archaeology of the plantation settlements must offer a particularly fascinating, maybe sometimes contested insight into that really transformative period in Irish history.
It does indeed. The various plantation schemes, most notably the large-scale Ulster plantation, which began formally in 1609, had a deliberate and profound goal: to dispossess native Irish landowners and replace them with loyal Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. The archaeological evidence recovered from these plant settlements provides a very tangible record of their impact on the Irish landscape, on settlement patterns, and on material culture, showing the encounter and sometimes clash of different traditions.
What are the key archaeological features we see associated with the plantations?
We see the deliberate foundation of new towns and villages, often very formally planned with regular street layouts, sometimes centered around a marketplace or a distinctive diamond shape, particularly in Ulster towns like Derry Londonderry or Coleraine. Grantees, the landowners who received confiscated land, were often required as part of their grant conditions to build fortified residences. This led to the construction of what are sometimes called plantation castles.
Different from tower houses.
Sometimes they involved adapting existing Gaelic tower houses, making them more comfortable or defensible in a new style. Other times, they were entirely new structures, often featuring strong walled enclosures called bonds, which were also a requirement. We also see the development of distinct types of fortified houses, which were less military than castles, but still offered security. And religiously, new Protestant churches were built, often with a simple rectangular plan, or existing medieval churches were adapted for Protestant worship. Examples like the church at Derrygonnelly or Clonfecal survive. Even the domestic dwellings of the settlers often reflected English and Scottish vernacular building styles and materials, sometimes contrasting quite clearly with traditional Irish building methods found nearby.
And those post-medieval fortified houses you mentioned, they sound like they represent a fascinating architectural bridge, maybe. A blend of the need for defense with a move towards more comfortable, maybe more English-style living.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. The post-medieval fortified house, which really became prominent in the late 16th and especially the early 17th centuries, represents a transition. It sits somewhere between the heavily defensive late medieval tower house and the later largely unfortified manor house or country house. These houses were built by various groups, established Old English families adapting to new times, some powerful Gaelic lords, and importantly, the new planter families arriving with the plantations. They were often larger and more spacious internally than tower houses, reflecting a growing desire for greater comfort and more rooms for specialized functions. But crucially, they still incorporated significant defensive features.
What kind of features?
They typically had a rectangular plan, sometimes with U or L-shaped wings creating a courtyard feel. Usually 2 or 3 stories high, often with high gables and prominent chimney stacks, which were themselves a sign of modernity and comfort. They featured much larger windows than tower houses, often with stone mullions and decorative hood moldings, indicating a greater emphasis on light and interior comfort, but these could still be secured with shutters. Internally, they had more spacious rooms, often with wooden partitions rather than vaulted stone floors, and significantly numerous fireplaces rather than just one main one.
Still defensive, though.
Oh, yes. Defensive elements could include gun loops strategically placed at ground level or in projections, small projecting turrets called bartizans at the corners of the roofline, sometimes angle towers providing flanking fire along the walls, and they were usually set within protective bond walls with fortified gateways. Occasionally, you might even see machicolations openings above the doorway for dropping things on attackers carried over from castle design. They were built primarily of stone, but with much more internal use of timber. They served as both a residence and a very clear display of the owner's status, power, and wealth, often reflecting more modern, anglicized architectural tastes. Great examples include Portumna Castle in Galway, Cantrick Castle in Cork, though famously unfinished, Burn Courthouse in Tipperary, and Rathfarnham Castle near Dublin.
Fascinating structures. And then moving away from the elite, we have the whole field of vernacular architecture, which focuses on the more everyday buildings of ordinary people across the centuries. What does that tell us?
That's right. Vernacular architecture is the study of the traditional, everyday buildings constructed by ordinary people, typically without formal architectural design or blueprints. These buildings, built using locally available materials and construction techniques passed down through generations, often orally or by example, provide absolutely invaluable insights into the daily lives, skills, customs, regional diversity, and economic conditions of past communities.
What kind of materials are we talking about?
The materials used varied hugely depending on the local geology and environment. Locally sourced stone was common, where available rubble stone, limestone, sandstone, granite. In other areas, mud, earth, or clay, sometimes mixed with straw, were primary walling materials. Timber was used for roof structures and internal fittings, and roofing materials were typically thatch made from locally grown straw, reed, or rush, or later. Imported slate or even corrugated iron became common in the 19th and 20th centuries.
And the forms? Simple structures?
Generally, yes. The form of these buildings was typically small and simple, often just 1 or 2 stories high. Rural dwellings often evolved with a long, low, linear plan, where rooms or extensions for animals or storage were added end to end over time. Construction was usually carried out by local craftspeople or even the occupants themselves, following established local traditions but also adapting to specific needs and site conditions. Walls were frequently finished with whitewash for protection and hygiene, or sometimes colored with natural pigments.
And lots of regional variation.
Huge regional variation. In building materials, stone being much more prevalent in the west and north, earth construction more common elsewhere, different techniques for building walls, different styles of thatching specific to certain areas. The types of buildings studied under vernacular architecture include not just rural dwellings or cottages, but also associated farm-out buildings like barns and byres, small rural mills, schools, smaller churches, or meeting halls.
When do most surviving examples date from?
Many of the vernacular buildings we can still see standing today date primarily from the 18th and 19th centuries, although the traditions they represent are often much older. Older examples are more likely to be found only as archaeological remains, perhaps just the stone footings or earth platforms. The study of vernacular architecture is absolutely crucial for understanding the wider historical landscape, the lives of the majority of the population, and for appreciating and sometimes preserving traditional builder skills.
Moving into more recent history again, industrial archaeology sheds light on Ireland's economic development, particularly from the 18th century onwards. How does Ireland compare to, say, Britain in that regard?
Well, industrial archaeology focuses on the physical remains of Ireland's industrialization process, and generally Ireland's industrial development was on a significantly smaller scale and happened later than in Britain, with the major exceptions being Belfast and the Logan Valley in the northeast, which became major centers of linen production and shipbuilding. Elsewhere, industrial activity tended to consist more of rural, often water-powered industries processing agricultural products or smaller local enterprises.
So what kind of sites does industrial archaeology in Ireland investigate?
Examples include milling complexes for grain, but also other processes. We find remains of watermills and windmills, including the mill buildings, water races, ponds, and sometimes surviving machinery. Linen production sites, particularly in Ulster, are very important. Archaeology can trace the whole process from flax cultivation in redding ponds through scutching mills to break down the fibers, spinning mills, large weaving factories, and beetling mills used to put a sheen on the finished linen, like the preserved Wellbrook beetling mill.
Mining, too.
Yes. Mining and quarrying sites for resources like copper, lead, silver, coal, slate. We find remains of shafts, adits, engine houses for pumping water, spoil heaps, processing areas. Distilling and brewing became major industries, and some historic buildings still survive within modern complexes, like at the Middleton Distillery or the Guinness Brewery in Dublin. Creameries, which became vital to the rural agricultural economy from the late 19th century, are another focus. And of course, transport infrastructure canals like the Royal and Grand Canals with their locks and bridges, the expensive railway network with stations, bridges, tunnels, and port facilities like docks and warehouses.
And a perhaps more dramatic field, battlefield archaeology. What can that tell us about the conflicts that have shaped Irish history?
Battlefield archaeology uses archaeological techniques to investigate sites where military conflicts took place. The aim is to gain a more detailed understanding of the events, the tactics used, the equipment involved, and sometimes even the experiences of the soldiers who fought and died there. This often involves systematic landscape analysis to reconstruct the terrain, metal detecting surveys to recover projectiles, fragments of weapons, uniform buttons, and other artifacts, and sometimes the careful excavation of features like defensive works or burial sites.
What periods are focused on in Ireland?
In Ireland, this field has often focused on the major conflicts of the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly the Cromwellian Wars of the 1640s and 50s and the Williamite War of 1689 to 91. Significant work has been done, for example, around the site of the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. The Visitor Centre at the Oldbridge Estate in County Meath displays archaeological finds like musket balls and interprets the battle landscape. Artifacts recovered from battle sites like Aughrim, the Boyne, Athlone are also held in the National Museum.
What about later conflicts?
The 1798 rebellion has also been the subject of archaeological interest. While many sites are marked by memorials, some archaeological work has been conducted, for example, at Vinegar Hill in County Wexford, a major rebel encampment and battle site where surveys have found evidence of firing lines and combat debris. Visitor facilities at other 98 sites like Ullart Hill or Three Rocks also help to interpret these often harrowing events on the ground.
Finally, let's talk about modern archaeological practice in Ireland today. It's become a really sophisticated and multifaceted field, hasn't it? Combining state institutions, research, commercial work, and community involvement.
Indeed, modern archaeological practice in Ireland is a dynamic field. It involves a wide range of activities undertaken by several key players. We have state institutions like the National Monument Service and the National Museum of Ireland, who have responsibilities for protection and curation. There are university research departments carrying out cutting-edge academic research. There's a large commercial archaeology sector that conducts excavations required in advance of development projects, roads, housing, pipelines, etc. And increasingly, there's a vibrant community archaeology sector involving local groups in investigating their own heritage.
And using lots of science.
Absolutely. Modern practice utilizes a huge range of sophisticated scientific techniques, from geophysical survey and LIDAR remote sensing to DNA analysis, isotopic analysis of human remains, advanced dating methods, material science. And there's a very strong emphasis now, not just on excavation, but on heritage management, protecting sites in the long-term public outreach and engagement, and also grappling with contemporary challenges like the very serious impact of climate change on vulnerable archaeological sites, particularly along the coast.
Can you briefly outline the roles of those key heritage institutions you mentioned?
Sure. The National Monument Service, or NMS, is part of the government department responsible for heritage. They have the primary statutory role in protecting Ireland's archaeological heritage. This includes identifying and designating archaeological sites and monuments for legal protection, maintaining the statutory inventory, the sites and monuments record, now accessible online via the Historic Environment Viewer. They implement the legislative protection under the National Monuments Acts, license all archaeological excavations, provide heritage advice to planning authorities and the public, manage the monuments that are in state care and open to the public, and they have specialist units dealing with things like underwater archaeology, archives, and World Heritage Sites.
And the National Museum.
The National Museum of Ireland, specifically its archaeology branch on Kildare Street in Dublin, serves as the national repository for archaeological finds. It holds over 2 million artifacts, an incredible collection spanning from the Mesolithic right through to the post-medieval period. Its Irish Antiquities Division is responsible for curating these collections, undertaking research, conservation, and crucially, public education through its amazing exhibitions like Warrior's Gold, Viking Ireland, Medieval Ireland that we've mentioned. The museum also plays a key statutory role in relation to archaeological excavations, underwater finds, and the control of artifact exports.
And the Heritage Council, they're slightly different.
Yes, the Heritage Council is an independent statutory body. Its role is more about promoting interest, knowledge, and conservation of Ireland's wider national heritage, natural and cultural. It supports a huge range of heritage initiatives financially and through expertise. This includes supporting archaeological research and survey projects, fantastic community-led projects like the Adopt a Monument scheme, conservation efforts like the Traditional Farm Buildings Grant Scheme, which helps preserve vernacular structures, and public awareness campaigns like National Heritage Week or the Know Your 5K initiative encouraging local heritage exploration. It also provides core funding and support for important bodies like the Irish Walled Towns Network and the Museum Standards Program for Ireland.
And the Discovery Program, that's more research-focused.
Exactly. The Discovery Program is an all-Ireland center dedicated to advanced research in archaeology. It's primarily funded by the Heritage Council. It undertakes large-scale, often technologically advanced, research projects focusing on key periods or themes in Irish archaeology. They've been pioneers in using cutting-edge tech like 3D laser scanning, airborne LIDAR survey, complex geophysical surveys. Past and current projects have focused on major sites and themes like the Tara landscape, the Western Stone forts, Ogham stones, creating amazing 3D models, late Iron Age and Roman Ireland interactions, medieval rural settlement patterns, coastal heritage threatened by climate change through the major Cherish project with Welsh partners, and developing digital archaeology resources like the AdaSat form. They really push the boundaries of research.
It sounds like a really vibrant research scene. Are there any particularly exciting recent discoveries that have hit the headlines?
There always seems to be something. One very recent significant find was the Bailey McCombs Moor woman, an Iron Age bog body discovered up in County Londonderry in 2023. She was a young woman who seems to have met a violent end, possibly decapitated, potentially another case of ritual sacrifice. What's particularly interesting is that most of the well-preserved Iron Age bog bodies previously found in Ireland were male, so this discovery adds a new dimension.
Any finds from development work?
Yes, often really nice objects turn up during road schemes or other infrastructure projects. For example, during work on the Adair Bypass in County Limerick just this year, 2024, they found a beautiful 8th or 9th century AD early medieval bronze brooch pin decorated with blue glass studs and intricate animal and abstract motifs. And a few years back, also in Limerick, the Crean hand pin was found a stunning 6th or 7th century AD type of pin, possibly Scottish in origin but popular in Ireland, with complex interlocking spirals and red enamel decoration. These finds often come from the crucial post-excavation analysis phase, where specialists meticulously study the huge amount of data and finds generated by developer-funded excavations. That analysis is absolutely vital work.
And what are some of the big research questions or themes that Irish archaeologists are focusing on right now?
Oh, there are many. Social structures in the Neolithic, particularly using ancient DNA analysis from tombs to understand kinship and community. The detailed study of monastic landscapes like Glendalough using survey and excavation. Investigating major ritual and assembly sites like the Hill of Ward, Lechka, or Rathcrogan, using large-scale geophysics to map buried features without digging. Understanding Mesolithic settlement, particularly in upland areas. The complex nature of late Iron Age society and its interactions with the Roman world is a hot topic. Medieval rural settlement and landscape change remains a major focus. The application of digital archaeology and remote sensing techniques is constantly evolving. The urgent need to record and understand coastal heritage threatened by climate change is driving projects like Cherish. And there's growing interest in the archaeology of the post-medieval and industrial periods, not just the big houses, but everyday life, housing, room use, health, diet, social identity, rural economies during those more recent centuries. It's a really broad and exciting field.
It really has been an absolutely incredible journey, hasn't it? Spanning millennia of history, right across Ireland. From those first, maybe tentative traces of human presence tens of thousands of years ago, right up to the sophisticated scientific practices of modern archaeology today. Ireland's archaeological record is just this powerful, tangible testament to human resilience, to innovation, and to the incredibly deep and enduring connection between people and this particular landscape.
Indeed. And I think what's so important to remember is how interconnected all these different periods are. You can't really understand one without knowing what came before. Each era builds upon, reacts against, or transforms what was already there. And our understanding of the past is never static. It's constantly being refined, challenged, and deepened through ongoing discoveries, new scientific techniques, and fresh interpretations. Archaeology provides us with these invaluable, sometimes deeply personal insights into the long and complex story of people and the Irish landscape, revealing the many, many layers of history that lie just beneath our feet.
So as you go about your day, maybe driving past a ring fort or seeing a ruined tower house on a hill, perhaps you'll think a little differently now about those layers of history that lie beneath your feet, maybe even beneath your own house or street. How do those distant pasts, those echoes of Mesolithic hunters, Neolithic tomb builders, Bronze Age metalworkers, Iron Age warriors, early monks, Vikings, Normans, how do they continue to shape our present, our identity, our landscape? And what amazing future discoveries might yet reveal even more about this enduring, fascinating relationship between people and the Irish land? Maybe this deep dive has even inspired you to visit some of these remarkable sites we've talked about, or to explore the truly world-class collections housed in the National Museum of Ireland. Thank you so much for joining us on the Deep Dive.